It all started with the solemn ringing of bells resonating through the heart of Vatican City. Rome stood still, and crowds gathered under the towering columns of St. Peter's Basilica. Their eyes were fixed on the sky as news anchors around the world rushed to confirm what many people feared but could hardly believe. Pope Francis, the 266th Pontiff of the Roman Catholic Church, was officially dead. The official cause of death was complications due to old age. The Vatican released a soft statement praising the Holy Father's lifelong service, calling him a humble shepherd of faith, a reformer, and a man of the people. Before we go any further, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell to get updates. But behind the white walls of the Apostolic Palace, something darker was simmering, because within 48 hours of the announcement, a series of leaks from Vatican insiders began trickling into European media. News outlets saw papal assistants whispering in the hallways, security footage was looked at, and medical records were gathered. The most damning evidence was a preliminary toxicology report that didn't match the Vatican story of a peaceful death. Instead, it talked about something scary. A rare, slow-acting compound found in Pope Francis's bloodstream that hadn't been found in any natural setting. Suddenly, this wasn't a story about an old pope passing away peacefully in the night. It was something else, something more sinister. As news of Pope Francis's death spread, few people realized that just hours before the Vatican announced it, Tagle had met with the Pope alone, without any helpers present. At first, some thought it was just a coincidence, but the autopsy results changed their minds. Cardinal Luis Antonio was a theologian with a deep intellect, a soft, spoken, charismatic figure loved across continents, and now he was at the center of a scandal that was about to shake the very foundations of the Catholic Church. The international media descended on Rome like wolves, spewing out conspiracy theories, half-truths, and questions that the Church could no longer ignore. What was found in the Pope's body, who was with him in his last hours? Why was the Vatican so reluctant to release the full autopsy report? And why, after decades of loyalty, would Cardinal Tagle be linked to a possible assassination? This wasn't just a theological crisis. It was a criminal one as well. To fully grasp how serious what's happening is, you need to know the landscape of power behind the Vatican's fancy facades. The Holy See may be one of the smallest sovereign states in the world, but its political, financial, and spiritual influence goes beyond borders, languages, and generations. For hundreds of years, its leaders have played a quiet but powerful role in world affairs, shaping everything from political policies to revolutions and treaties. When the head of such a body dies in mysterious circumstances, the world is shocked. When one of the Church's most beloved cardinals is arrested on suspicion of being involved, everyone pays attention. From Manila to Madrid, from Buenos Aires to Boston, questions about how Pope Francis really died, and more disturbingly, was it murder, were heard over the cathedral bells. According to sources in the Italian police, the toxicology results were kept secret for almost 24 hours, and some people in the church hierarchy weren't even told what was found in Pope Francis's bloodstream was not a common toxin or drug overdose. It was a compound so uncommon that even forensic scientists had trouble identifying it at first. It had properties similar to neurotoxins known to cause long-term cognitive degradation symptoms that could be mistaken for heart problems or dementia caused by getting older. But when combined with certain biological factors, this compound could mimic natural decline and then kill with precision. Initial reports said the compound was given in very small amounts. Possibly someone planned this for weeks or months. So it wasn't an accident. It was planned, calculated, and evil. By the time the Pope collapsed, it may have already been too late. As Vatican officials were forced to admit the lab results, the walls of silence began to fall. Rumors of foul play gave way to internal investigations. Hard drives were searched, and cloned surveillance tapes from inside the papal residence were looked at frame by frame. One thing became painfully clear. Cardinal, this is shocking because Tagle was the last person known to have visited Pope Francis in the 12 hours before his death. To understand who Tagle is, or rather who he was supposed to be born in Manila in 1957, you need to know his meteoric rise in the Catholic Church. Like Francis, he became known as a reformer, and he was a man of the people who spoke many languages and connected with Catholics from different cultures. His mix of intellectual brilliance and heartfelt simplicity made him a media darling. When Pope Francis was elected in 2013, Tagle was already seen as a possible pope. The two had a lot in common, especially when it came to poverty, climate change, and church reform. But as time went on, their views started to diverge. Francis stayed focused on transparency and getting rid of corruption in the church, while some said Tagle was joining forces with more conservative groups to get the papacy. After Francis, there were rumors of tension, but it was not overt. Disagreements in council meetings and a change in tone during sermons were not what anyone, including the Vatican, expected. After the arrest, Vatican spokespeople carefully chose their words. An ongoing investigation is underway at this time. We ask for prayers and privacy as we mourn our Holy Father. But prayers weren't enough to stop the media frenzy that happened within hours. A cardinal was arrested in connection with the mysterious death of Pope Francis. It was the worst time for the Vatican since, as the investigation into Benedict's resignation continues, millions of people are filled with a deeper fear. If a pope can be quietly silenced, what else could be going on behind those gilded doors? This isn't just about a death. It's also about betrayal and power. It's about the terrifying possibility that a plot took place in one of the world's oldest institutions and no one noticed until it was too late. But don't get the wrong idea. This story is far from over. Many questions still remain. Why would a cardinal who was so loved and respected risk everything? Was this really just one man's actions, or is he being used as a scapegoat for something much worse? Were others involved? And most importantly, what will the Vatican do now that the world is looking into its deepest secrets? Stay tuned. We're about to take you inside the timeline, the evidence, the psychology, and the power struggles that led to one of the most shocking events in modern religious history. Before the autopsy, there was just a man named Jorge Mario Bergoglio. He was born in Buenos Aires, Argentina, to Italian immigrants and wanted to be a chemist or maybe just live a quiet life with books and solitude. Instead, he became a priest, and after decades of faith, conflict, and a strong commitment to humility, he became Pope Francis, the first pope from the Americas. It's important to know who Pope Francis was in order to understand not only why the world mourned his death, but also why it sent shockwaves beyond Catholicism. It wasn't just that he was the Pope. It was that he was this Pope who washed the feet of prisoners and refugees and scolded clergy for their gold crosses and designer ropes. It was this Pope who told the world to stop chasing after money. He didn't just talk about the gospel, he lived it even when it led to rough seas. Francis's papacy from the start wasn't one of quiet tradition. He broke rules and challenged power structures that had been in place for hundreds of years. When he stepped onto the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica in March 2013 and gave his first humble blessing as Pope, few people knew how revolutionary that moment would become. Here was a man who refused to. There was a leader who refused to wear the traditional red shoes and instead wore not black ones. There was a pontiff who asked everyone to call him Father instead of Your Holiness. These may seem like small gestures, but in the Vatican, symbolism is everything. In just his first year as Pope, Pope Francis started to make big changes. He dealt with scandals that had been plaguing the Church for decades, like clerical abuse, financial secrecy, and the people were losing faith in him. So he let outside auditors look at the Vatican's bank records, reorganized powerful councils, and even forced high-ranking officials to resign. He was also honest about things that previous popes had either avoided or condemned. He acknowledged that there were gay priests saying, "Who am I to judge?" He met transgender people and talked openly about gender identity. He felt sorry for divorced Catholics and pushed for changes to show that the Church welcomes them. In a circular letter, he called for the world to take climate change seriously as both a scientific and a moral crisis. It was clear that Pope Francis wasn't leading the Church from a throne. He was leading it from the streets, and people followed him from slums in Brazil to orphanages in Congo, from busy cities in Europe to small villages in the Philippines. Millions of people were connected with this pope. His words were simple, his face was warm, and he was easy to talk to, which is unheard of in a role that is usually shrouded in mystery. He went from being a religious figure to a real person, but not everyone liked the way he did things. Behind closed doors, conservative groups started to fight back. Many people thought Francis was opening doors that shouldn't have been opened. Francis's enemies didn't say much, but they did leak documents and slowly build alliances to fight his reforms. Some said Francis was destroying sacred traditions, while others said he was watering down doctrine to make it more appealing to modern people. There were more cultural and theological arguments about sexuality, marriage, and the role of women in the Church, but Francis stayed strong. He believed that love was more important than law and that compassion was not a compromise, but the opposition didn't go away. In 2018, Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano wrote a letter accusing Pope Francis of covering up abuse scandals. Francis neither confirmed nor denied the accusation, but it led to a lot of negative talk about Francis in the global Church, and conspiracy theorists called him, he was called a fraud by radicals, and former allies and even some cardinals started quietly jockeying for succession as they sensed that the winds of power might soon shift again, but the world continued to revere him. World leaders praised him for bringing religious differences together and calling for peace in dangerous areas. Refugees held up his pictures in camps, and kids carried his messages in notebooks. He was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, and he was called the People's Pope. Even though he was on the covers of Time, Rolling Stone, and even Esquire, he was clearly tired. By 2022, his health was clearly getting worse. He had surgery on his intestines and was often seen in a wheelchair. His speeches slowed down and his eyesight got worse, but he never stopped working, never stopped fighting for justice, and never stopped being the one person in a centuries-old institution who dared to say, "We must change." That's why his death was first met with deep respect but not shock. He was 88 years old, and his body had been working hard for decades. His painful death seemed natural, at least until those first rumors spread, until the toxicology reports came in and Cardinal Tagle's name came up. It's important to remember who Pope Francis was, not just because of what he did, but also because of what was done to him. His papacy wasn't just about fixing a broken church. It was about challenging systems of unchecked power. Some people are now wondering if Francis died for his beliefs, if his compassion, his reforms, and his desire to break centuries of silence were what signed his death certificate. It's a painful question, but more people are being brave enough to ask it since he died. This wasn't just the end of a papacy, it may have been the end of a revolution. If that's true, then Pope Francis was killed not by time, but by the revolution itself. The world needs to face a truth that is much darker than any cathedral shadow. We need to face not only his legacy, but also the betrayal of that legacy. Because if someone inside the walls of the Vatican wanted to kill a man whose only weapon was mercy, then what else have they been hiding behind those walls? At first, April 5th seemed like any other day in the walled peace of Vatican City. The morning sun came in through the tall windows, casting golden light on the apostolic palace, along centuries-old stone hallways. Swiss guards took turns watching as clergy made their way to morning Mass, and Vatican staff carried hot cups of coffee to offices behind fancy wooden doors. Inside the papal residence, Pope Francis was already awake and getting ready for what should have been a normal day of prayer meetings. In correspondence, there were no alarms going off and no visible signs of trouble, but by evening the Vatican would be in a deep crisis. By evening, the Holy Father would be pronounced dead, and by morning, murmurs of confusion and suspicion would start to spread through Rome like ivy on an old wall. What happened in those hours has been closely studied, not just because of who died, but also because of how he died. What follows is a reconstruction of Pope Francis's last day based on leaked internal memos, eyewitness reports, Vatican schedules, and insider accounts that paint a haunting picture of a 7:30 a.m. morning prayers and breakfast. According to papal tradition, Francis started his day with private prayers in the chapel next to his home at Casa Santa Marta, the guest house where he had chosen to live instead of the fancy apostolic palace. This choice had always confused traditionalists but won him fans among regular Christians. By 8:15 a.m., the chapel was quiet and no one had noticed anything out of the ordinary. His personal assistant, Monsignor Matteo Raldi, brought him breakfast, which included warm toast, fresh fruit, and his favorite tea, yerba mate. The Pope reportedly smiled, joked about the weather, and even asked the gardener's new granddaughter how she was doing. All signs pointed to a man in a good mood. But soon after, according to Raldi's later statement, the Pope didn't finish his breakfast and complained of a faint headache and an odd tightness in his chest. It wasn't enough to set off alarms, but it was strange for him. Even though he had just had surgery, the man had seemed clear, headed and steady in the days before he asked to cancel his 10 a.m. meeting with an Economic Affairs Commission and chose to rest in his room instead. The meeting had been planned for weeks, and Francis had never canceled a meeting without giving a reason before 10:45 a.m. As for the timeline, security logs show that Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle arrived at the papal residence around 10:42 a.m. His visit wasn't on the Pope's schedule for that day. There was no written appointment, no help was present, and there was no official record of the meeting's purpose. Several staff members confirmed seeing Tagle enter the guest house, and surveillance footage reportedly shows him being led to the private elevator where he went up alone to Pope's quarters. What was there is a lot of talk about what happened in that room, but all that is known is that Cardinal Tagle stayed there for about 34 minutes. No one knows what happened during those 34 minutes because it was kept secret. Later, a staff member who spoke on the condition of anonymity said that when Tagle left the Pope's residence, his face looked tense and he walked faster than usual. He refused to talk to anyone and quickly left the building. Francis, on the other hand, was not seen again until 1:30 p.m. By noon, there was silence and shadows, and aides started to worry that the Pope hadn't come out for lunch, which he usually ate with close friends in the dining hall. His communications team said that calls from visiting bishops who were supposed to meet him later that afternoon and a second time at 3:30 p.m. had gone unanswered. In the Vatican Gardens, a low-key event that was supposed to include a short blessing for international pilgrims was cancelled for no apparent reason. Raldi knocked on the Pope's door several times but got no answer at first, which wasn't seen as a big deal because the Pope is known to sleep or meditate for long periods of time. But by 4:15 p.m., concern turned to unease and papal guards were called. At 4:43 p.m., medical staff were discreetly contacted, but there was no response. Raldi and his security detail went into the private chambers and found Pope Francis slumped in an armchair next to his desk, holding on to the rosary. He was unconscious but barely breathing, and paramedics were called right away. They tried to stabilize his pulse, give him oxygen, and wake him up, but he never fully recovered. even though they tried hard, Pope Francis was officially declared dead at 6:02 p.m. The statement from Vatican spokesman Matteo Brun was short. His Holiness Pope Francis has returned to the house of the Father. He passed peacefully this evening at 6:02 p.m. Surrounded by members of his closest staff, they asked the faithful to join in prayer as the Church mourns. Some members of the papal court demanded silence, saying that revealing the nature of the Pope's wounds could cause panic and anger. Others, mostly younger clergy and staffers, pushed for openness because they thought that hiding the truth would only lead to more conspiracy theories and doubt. The turning point came when Dr. Guarini turned in his preliminary autopsy notes. Even though they were carefully worded, they pointed out 5 important facts. The symmetrical cuts were made after the death or within moments of it. This suggests that the violence was planned rather than random, and the cauterization technique used was consistent with medical-grade equipment. The symbols weren't from everyday items. They looked like they belonged in Renaissance occult manuscripts, especially those with forbidden theological doctrines. There were no signs of heart failure, a stroke, or other natural causes. The Pope's vocal cords had minor abrasions, which suggested he may have tried to speak or even scream just before he died. What happened next was both expected and strange. At exactly 4:03 p.m., in front of a dozen cameras, Vatican Press Secretary Father Giovanni Marone read a short, carefully checked statement that said, "It is with deep sorrow that we confirm that His Holiness Pope Francis passed away peacefully in his sleep. The Vatican offers prayers for the soul of our beloved shepherd and urges the global community to join us in solemn mourning." That was it. No questions, no details, no mention of incisions, no mention of Vice President J.D. Vance. It was just a gentle nod to tradition. There was grief and silence, but just hours after the news came out, a man was shot dead. An anonymous member of the Vatican's medical team gave one of the autopsy photos to an Italian investigative reporter named Elizio Romano. The photo, which was grainy but clear, showed the Pope's upper torso with ghostly pale skin and clear marks. Within minutes, the picture was shared on encrypted forums, and within hours, it was on the front page of European news sites. There was an immediate public outcry, and the Vatican's veil of secrecy fell. Journalists wanted answers, and religious leaders wanted to see them. Markings on the body were interpreted by theologians as indicating ties to ancient cults or even biblical prophecy. The markings themselves looked like what some called the seal of the forsaken shepherd, a mythological symbol found in some apocryphal gospels and banned spiritual texts. While scholars disagreed on the authenticity of the markings, one thing was clear: this was not a normal death. That night, Cardinal Benedetto Sarno, a known progressive in the Cura, made a bold statement during a private memorial in Massachusetts. Almost right away, broadcasts were leaked. If we deny what our eyes have seen and our hands have touched, then we deny not only the truth but also the very foundation of our Church. We must ask not only how the Holy Father died, but also why someone would leave a signature behind. In the meantime, President Donald Trump kept quiet in public. The U.S. made no official comment on the vice president's alleged presence in Rome that night, but diplomatic pressure started to build behind the scenes. There were a lot of private calls following talks between Washington and Rome. Italian officials confirmed that J.D. Vance was still being held under a special international protocol that is only given in very serious cases. The Pope's body was moved to a restricted crypt beneath St. Peter's Basilica, and his funeral was postponed, which was not typical. There were rumors that forensic experts wanted to exhume previous popes for comparison, and some even said there was a secret war going on inside the Vatican between those who wanted to hide the scandal and those who were afraid of it. This was just the beginning. On day 3, something even stranger happened. The Vatican confirmed that it had officially stopped using its internal surveillance systems in the Pope's quarters. When asked why, a spokesman said that the footage is being reviewed as part of an ongoing investigation. However, people who know about the security systems said that whole sections of video had gone missing, with blank spots and gaps in time. For example, an 8-minute block of video that started exactly at the time J.D. Vance left the palace had been missing, overwritten. It wasn't clear if this was a technical glitch or an intentional wipe, but it only made people more suspicious. People started to come to their own conclusions. Polls in Europe showed that more than 60% of people thought Pope Francis had been killed in Latin America, where the Pope was from. That number rose to almost 80%. The streets of Buenos Aires were filled with candlelight vigils for both the Pope and Justice. Signs said "No feign natural," and "La Verde y Dana," which translated to "It was not natural, truth is divine." J.D. Vance was being held in a private room outside of Rome, surrounded by lawyers and not allowed to go to any public event. He hadn't said a word since he was arrested, not a statement, not a denial, not even a whispered word of explanation. But investigators would soon find something that changed the story again. Tiny pieces of titanium that are commonly used in surgical equipment were found under the Pope's fingernails. These particles matched a brand made in Ohio, which is the same state where J.D. Vance had been a representative for before he became president. This may have been a coincidence, but in a case already full of symbols, silence, and suspicion, coincidence started to look a lot like choreography. As the Church got ready to announce a conclave, an event usually used to choose a new pope, whispered in the Vatican halls took on a darker, more urgent tone because this wasn't just about death anymore. It was about legacy and secrets that wouldn't stay buried. No death in the Vatican has ever been about what happened in the clean, guarded basement of the Vatican medical wing after Pope Francis' death broke hundreds of years of carefully kept tradition. Autopsies on popes are not illegal, but they are very uncommon. Usually, trusted doctors figure out the cause of death, and the Church moves on with funeral arrangements before anyone starts to ask questions. But this case was so different from the start that it was scary. There were so many questions that needed to be answered. Vatican officials had to start a formal autopsy, which was watched over by both internal medical staff and outside forensic experts who were brought in under strict confidentiality. One of them was Dr. Matteo Guarini, Italy's top forensic pathologist, who had already looked at the Pope's body as soon as it was found. With pressure from the Curia and people around the world growing, he was given the job of finding out what or who caused the most shocking death in modern papal history. The autopsy started at 11:42 a.m. A few days after the Pope's death, Guarini walked in wearing a simple black suit and was accompanied by two assistants carrying a custom medical case containing the most advanced imaging and dissection tools in Europe. The room was set up like a military operation with steel tables, triple sealed doors, and security guards stationed at every exit. Only 6 people were allowed inside, and they all had to sign nondis, closure agreements under oath of spiritual confidence. By the end of the procedure, they had all changed from when they arrived. It was pointed out that Pope Francis's physical condition did not match the official story of his death by natural causes. His body showed no major signs of heart failure, stroke, embolism, or aneurysm, and his internal organs were in great shape for his age. In fact, according to early medical reports, Pope Francis could have easily lived another 5 to 10 years. What stood out were the markings. There were 6 distinct incisions, each one placed with great care. Though the cuts weren't jagged or rough. Instead, they looked almost artistic from a distance. Up close, they could have been mistaken for intricate tattoos or surgical lines, but the team soon realized these weren't random marks. They were symmetrical geometric designs with a kind of symbolic logic that suggested knowledge far beyond normal anatomy. Each cut had been cauterized with a thermal tool, most likely a heated blade or a laser. The edges of wounds were charred but not bleeding, and the tissue the cuts below had hardened in a way that suggested controlled burning. They weren't the result of a fight or a struggle. They were done in a methodical, almost religious way. What most upset Guarini was where they were placed. The cuts made a star-shaped pattern across the Pope's chest, with the center of the star being the heart. From there, the lines went outward toward the shoulders and ribs, creating what some later described as a reverse pinnacle, a symbol often used in cults going back hundreds of years. It wasn't a normal 5-point star. This one had 6 points, 6 segments, and at its center, an intersection that lined up perfectly with the Pope's sternum. This alignment brought back a memory for Guerini from years ago when he was at a joint forensic conference in Prague studying ancient esoteric practices linked to ritual murders in medieval Europe. In one case involving a murdered bishop in the 1400s, identical cuts were found on the cleric's chest that were burned into his flesh in the exact same shape. The resemblance was more than just a coincidence. It was chilling. Guerini stopped the procedure, took off his gloves, and asked to see the Vatican's restricted medical archives. What he found there even shocked him more: a dusty file called Codex Ritus Negatus, or the Codex of Forbidden Rites, had drawings that were almost exact copies of the markings on Pope Francis's body. According to the Codex, the symbol was called Stellum Veritatis Occulti, or the Star of Hidden Truth. Be used in a forbidden ritual that silenced the voice of divine leadership through sacrificial offering. In other words, the person who did this didn't just kill someone. They also carried out a ritual meant to silence the Pope's spiritual voice. Further investigation revealed even more disturbing details. Tiny holes were found under the fingernails of both hands, as if small instruments had been inserted to extract blood or tissue. A thin layer of ash had settled in the folds of the Pope's robe. Later, a lab test confirmed that the body had traces of burnt olive wood and myrrh, which are common in ancient Middle Eastern burial rituals. Even the Pope's eyes showed signs of interference. The corneas had small scratches that weren't bad enough to make the person blind, but were enough to suggest they had been touched or manipulated after the person died. Guerini thought this might have been part of the ritual, a way of symbolically closing the Pope's spiritual and literal eyes. But the scariest discovery came when the team analyzed the leftover chemicals in the cuts and found a rare compound called silver nitrate mixed with an organic binder made from animal fat and pine resin. This mixture was used in the past in a practice called sigillum exustio, which was a type of branded inscription thought to bind the soul of the dead to silence and stop spiritual messages from crossing into the mortal realm. In modern terms, it was ritual silencing. At this point, the Vatican was split into two groups. One made up mostly of traditionalists and conservative clergy wanted the Holy See to hide the results, saying they would cause mass hysteria. On the other hand, younger clergy and progressive theologians said that hiding the truth would be a betrayal of everything the Church stood for. In the end, a group of senior cardinals made the decision that the autopsy would remain secret and the results sealed. Only the Pope's closest advisors and the forensic team would know truth, but secrets, especially ones that are laced with ritual and death, have a way of staying hidden. Within 48 hours, parts of the Codex Ritus Negatus started to circulate on secret academic forums. Unknown emails sent to newsrooms around the world included photos, chemical analysis charts, and comparisons to other ritualistic deaths in church history. The pictures and documents were fuzzy and incomplete, but they were enough to make people suspicious. One expert, Dr. Helena Moravec of the University of Belgrade, said on TV that these marks are not accidental, they are meant to be there. Follow a tradition that most modern theologians thought had died out. If the Pope really did show these signs, then we are not looking at murder but at a warning. That question set off a firestorm, and everyone's attention quickly turned to J.D. Vance. Everything he did in the days before and after the Pope's death was carefully examined. Surveillance footage showed Vance entering a private room used by the Vatican's archbishops without permission, and reports came out that he had inquiries about old documents related to prophetic changes in the papal seat back in Rome. Members of papal medical units started quietly resigning. Some went back to their home countries and others just disappeared. There were rumors that even the most outspoken experts were being silenced by internal pressure or fear of something much bigger. But Guerini kept going. He put together a private dossier for the College of Cardinals that included a final conclusion that Pope Francis did not die he died naturally, but it was part of a ceremony, a rite, a ritual whose purpose, meaning, and roots were much older than anyone was willing to admit. The dossier ended with a single line: "This was not an act of violence, it was an act of theology perverted but precise." This phrase hit the Vatican like a tsunami. A secret conclave was planned to choose a new pope and decide the future direction of the Church. Some people whispered that what would happen next would not be a spiritual transition, but a war between light and shadow tradition, and as the Vatican bells tolled again, resonating through the ancient city, people all over the world held their breath. What they found in the autopsy room wasn't just evidence, it was a written prophecy. By the time the autopsy results got to a small group of cardinals, the Vatican had already closed off parts of its library, put surveillance on several employees, and called together a private investigation panel in complete secrecy, but outside of its own walls. The story was already getting out to the public, changed and stoked by the word cult. To someone who wasn't familiar with Vatican history, the idea that the Pope's death might have been connected to ancient occult practices sounded like something out of a medieval legend or an internet rumor. But to those who had studied the long history of the Vatican, the word cult carried a heavy, unsettling familiarity, not because it was shocking, but because it made sense. The Catholic Church, in all its beauty and holiness, has long existed side by it has buried secrets under basilicas, hidden whole libraries of forbidden texts, and fought with philosophies that were thought to be too dangerous to see the light of day. Somewhere in this long, running battle between spiritual light and theological darkness are whispers of the Veritas Sectum, or Silent Brotherhood. Many scholars think this group was purged by the Pope in the 17th century and was made up of rogue clergy and theologians who believed in fusing scripture with modern ideas. They were kicked out of the church, hunted down, and supposedly killed, but their ideas didn't die, they spread. That's why, when incisions were found on Pope Francis's body that looked like those in ancient grimoire books connected to the same illegal order, a lot of people started to wonder if this was just a coincidence, or if something much older than modern power structures had made its way back into the Church. Professor Henry Delacroix, a religious historian from the University of Paris, who had written a lot about Vatican papers that were being kept secret. In a special broadcast, Delacroix said, "What we are seeing may not be an isolated act of violence, but a calculated signal rooted in forgotten theology that has come back to life for reasons we are just beginning to understand." Delroy pointed to a certain manuscript called the Liberis, also known as the Night Book. This is a rare book that was found in the catacombs below the Vatican during renovations in the late 1800s. The manuscript is now said to be hidden in the Vatican's sealed archives and describes a ritual in which a religious figure is marked with sigils during their last breath to silence their divine resonance and direct their influence toward someone else. The phrase "direct their influence toward someone else" caused a lot of speculation that it could be Pope Francis's death was more than just a symbol. Could it have been a plan to silence the Pope's message? If so, what better way than a ritual meant to spiritually silence him? But that raises an even darker question: who stood to gain? Few people had access to both the Pope and the historical knowledge of such rituals. Even fewer had the anatomical skill to make the precise cuts, and even fewer still who could have done them. However, the meeting with J.D. Vance, who is now under a lot of international scrutiny, remained the threat that investigators could not ignore. According to surveillance logs, Vance's presence in the Apostolic Palace coincided exactly with the time of the Pope's death, though no one has directly accused him of performing the ritual. Analysts suggest that his role may not have been physical but catalytic. In intelligence circles, there is a concept called a spiritual trigger, and someone whose presence, words, or influence sets off a pre-planned action without them doing anything. If Vance's conversation with the Pope was carefully crafted and contained certain phrases, symbols, or messages, it's possible that he could have unknowingly or willingly set off an ancient ride in motion. Is that a conspiracy or a coincidence? That question became the focus of a growing investigation. Vatican internal intelligence, working with Italian security officials, started looking through archives, interviews, and according to intelligence reports, a shocking discovery was made in a little-known cultural center in Lisbon. It was a picture of J.D. Vance as a college student in 2004, attending a symposium on comparative religion and ancient rites. One of the lecturers at that symposium was a defrocked Jesuit priest who had written a lot about the topic. The photo showed a clear sequence of events that would set the stage for what was to come. Tagle had visited the papal residence 3 times on the morning of Francis's death. According to the Vatican's guest log, Tagle arrived at 10:42 a.m., which was a visit that was already known to the public. However, there was another timestamp 7:16 a.m. that was hidden deep within the building's internal access data. Security footage showed Tagle entering through a side door that was mostly used by senior clergy and top medical staff. He was wearing only a black cassock and white collar, and the footage only lasted a few seconds, but it was enough to clearly identify him before the camera cut to another hallway. The visit hadn't been reported, and no one knew why. Investigators became suspicious right away. Why would a man of Tagle's status hide a visit from the Pope just hours before the Pope was found unconscious? And why hadn't the visit been written down in the official logs? The tribunal started going through every meeting Tagle had and all the official documents he had signed in the 3 months before Francis's death. This is when a second important clue came to light. Financial documents. Tagle had signed the purchase of a rare herbal supplement from a private distributor in Southeast Asia went through an offshore middle-man company registered in the Cayman Islands. At first glance, the deal seemed harmless, but when analysts looked into the product's chemical breakdown, they found a stabilizing compound that looked a lot like isomer 3x41, the neurotoxin that was found in Pope Francis's body. The supplement had been given to Pope Francis as a health booster, something to improve his blood pressure and clarity, according to a short note. The supplement was later found in a locked drawer in the Pope's private study. The Vatican's internal chemist tested the dried leaves and found small amounts of the compound. The compound wasn't deadly in one dose, but it was dangerous over time, and that time had run out. More evidence kept coming in. Tagle's Vatican issued phone showed encrypted texts with a number that later turned out to belong to a former pharmacologist who had been flagged by Interpol for illegal activities. Even though a lot of the content had been deleted, forensic data recovery teams were able to find pieces of messages that talked about dosage calibration and sustained potency in elderly subject. The data might not have been reliable on its own, but when looked at together with the timing of the surveillance, the communication, and the ingredients, it was damning. The Vatican was hesitant to arrest a cardinal, especially one as famous as Tagle, because it would be illegal and could cause the Church's already fragile foundations to fall apart. It could lead to riots, defections, or even diplomatic retaliation in places where Tagle was respected. So the decision had to be thought out. Vatican officials called the Italian government and suggested a plan that would let Gendarmi, the mayor of Vatican City, start the arrest while being supervised to make sure it was legal, kept quiet, and caused as little trouble as possible. The Italian Caribbean would stay nearby to help if needed. The plan was approved on April 9th evening, and Tagle was told he gladly agreed to lead early morning prayers in the gardens as a quiet way to prepare for Easter. He smiled at aides and asked about the gardener's son, just like Pope Francis had done days before. What he didn't know was that every path he took had been mapped out. The Vatican garden was chosen for its privacy, silence, and distance from the public, but more importantly, so that security could control every possible exit at 6:26 a.m. At 6:30 a.m., Tagle walked onto the main path while carrying a rosary and a small Bible. He stopped near a marble statue of St. Peter, which remembered the founder of the church he had once hoped to lead. 2 minutes later, he was handcuffed, and witnesses say he didn't fight or ask why the person who handcuffed him didn't raise his voice. He just said, "You don't understand." Those were the only words he said as he was led to a secure vehicle, surrounded by silent officers in plain clothes. The car drove directly to a hidden access tunnel that led to the Vatican's internal detention wing, one that is rarely used and only for cases that are too dangerous for public scrutiny. There, he was put in a private holding cell and watched 24 hours a day. That same day, the Vatican released a statement that shocked the world following an internal investigation, and in cooperation with civil authorities, Cardinal Luis Antonio Cardinal Tagle has been taken into protective custody to be questioned about a very sensitive, ongoing matter. We ask for prayers and peace as we search for the truth. The Vatican never said arrest, but the world heard it within hours. The story made headlines on every news outlet. Is this the end of the Asian Francis betrayal in the Vatican? Cardinal Tagle is being questioned about the death of Pope Francis in the Holy See. People all over the world were shocked. In Manila, thousands of people gathered outside of cathedrals to pray by candlelight. In Rome, protests broke out, with some calling for Tagle to be released and others saying that the truth should be made public. Meanwhile, inside the thick walls of the Vatican, investigators were getting ready for the next step because arresting Tagle was only the beginning. There were still too many unanswered questions about the toxin lab, the missing emails, the shredded documents, the coded communications, and the anonymous Vatican help, who had gone missing 3 days before the Pope died, and the burning question that rang louder than any cathedral bell: was Cardinal Tagle acting alone? It was unlike anything most forensic pathologists had ever seen, a compound that didn't belong in any pharmacy or chemical registry, a formula carefully crafted to look natural in order to act slowly and kill quietly. But this compound, isomer 3x41, wasn't just a tool for silent murder. It had a darker history that went beyond that. At first, experts in modern chemistry and the shadows of symbolic evil thought the toxicology discovery was just another case of poisoning. The Vatican's medical team, with help from outside experts in Milan and Geneva, broke down the compound into its constituent parts. Isomer 3x41 was a synthetic neurotoxic agent known to disrupt neurotransmission in the brain and affect cardiac output. If someone took the wrong dose, or even the right dose over time, it would slowly destroy their cognitive function and autonomic regulation memory. Researchers weren't just worried about the compound's effect. They were also worried about how it was made. The compound was made so precisely that it mimicked the gradual decline of a natural death, and the symptoms it caused were eerily similar to what happens to elderly patients near the end of their lives. The symptoms Pope Francis had, like fatigue, confusion, headaches, and mild cardiac stress, could have been mistaken for normal aging. Before the autopsy, a forensic chemist from the Milan lab, who did not want to be named for fear of retaliation, made a private statement to Vatican investigators that changed the whole case. He said that the substance wasn't made to kill out of anger. It was made to kill as a ritual. It was made to erase not only life, but also the idea that life had ever been taken. His words sent chills through the room because while isomer 3x41 was known in a small group of toxicology circles, its full profile had never been shared. Trace markers in the compound, especially a binding agent derived from a rare variant of mandrake root, linked it not only to medical history, but also to a much older, darker tradition, occult pharmacology. To fully understand the implications, the Vatican's special tribunal talked to a group of theological historians and anthropological experts. What they found was troubling. The binding formula found in the compound was very similar to recipes found in 17th century books. During times of political unrest in Europe in the 15th century, secret societies used grimoires to keep their secrets. Many of these texts were banned and spread during the Counter-Reformation, and they talked about slow poisoning as a way to make spiritual sacrifices and quietly cut off divine power. One of these documents, which is kept in the British Library with limited access, talks about a compound called lactazedemonium, which means milk of the demon. Its ingredients were mandrich mistletoe and tinctures made from nightshade. It was thought that taking certain amounts of it would gradually separate the soul from the body, leading to disorientation, hallucinations, and eventually heart failure. The link wasn't just chemical, it was symbolic as well. And that wasn't all. When Vatican pathologists examined Pope Francis's body, they noticed faint bruises in the shape of geometric patterns along his abdomen, just below the rib cage. At first, they thought these might be post-mortem tissue trauma or pressure points from his chair. A closer look revealed something much scarier. The bruises were symmetrical, with 6 points forming a circle in the middle. When compared to diagrams from known occult texts, the shape matched what was historically known as the seal of silencing, a symbol used in early esoteric rituals to keep a subject from telling the truth or revealing hidden knowledge. To the naked eye, it looked like simple discoloration, but under ultraviolet light, remnants of a rare mineral compound called cinnabar mixed with iron oxide was discovered in the pores. This mixture was known to contain ceremonial inks used by ancient cult scribes. What was it doing on the Pope's body, and who put it there? Documents taken from Cardinal Tagle's office gave investigators more disturbing information. In prayer journals and church correspondence, they found a small leather-bound notebook written in Latin and an old form of Filipino script. Inside, there were pages with handwritten liturgical symbols mixed in with alchemical formulas. Ritual diagrams, some of which lined up exactly with the geometric pattern found on Francis's body. Even scarier, one page had a phrase written 3 times in serotonin, "Your voice shall be sealed." Some Vatican historians think this wasn't just a planned murder. They think it was a symbolic one, an attempt to silence Pope Francis not only in life but also in death, to erase his message, his reforms, and the truth he carried. If this was true, it would mean one terrible thing for Tagle or whoever planned the murder. The people who poisoned weren't just trying to get ahead, they were also following a ritual. The question that followed scared investigators more than any other. Was this an isolated event, or was it part of something bigger? One theory, backed by Vatican intelligence and scholars in spiritual warfare, said that a long-thought, dead secret group within the Church called the Lucifer Noster, or Our Light Bearers, might still be active. The group is said to have started in the early 1600s as a breakaway sect of clergy who thought that the only way to gain spiritual power was to turn divine order into chaos, light into darkness, and mercy into silence. The group has been long thought to be a conspiracy or myth, but references to it can be found in secret Vatican archives. The most recent known mention was in 1969 during Pope Paul VI's reign, in a report that warned of esoteric infiltration among theologically unsupervised clerical circles. Recently, there have been rumors that the group has regained its power and become more established. There had been no proof until now because one of the symbols drawn in Tagle's secret notebook, the same one that was found on the Pope's skin, also showed up in that 1969 document. Suddenly, the poisoning of Pope Francis wasn't a crime. It was a message written not in words or ink, but in rituals and silence. Why Francis? The answer seemed to lie in his mission. As soon as he became Pope, he talked about being open and honest and opening up the Church's darkest parts. He opened up about abuse, demanded resignations, and suggested financial audits that could have destroyed centuries of untouchable wealth and hidden alliances. He changed what it meant to lead, not with iron and secrecy, but with service and openness to those invested in the old ways that made him dangerous. Pope John Paul I died in mysterious circumstances after only 33 days in office, and his death is still officially unexplained. Some people now wonder what happened. If the same thing happened to Pope Francis, but with a lot more complicated and symbolic machinery behind it. Right now, Scientists are still looking into the chemical parts of isomer 3x41 and trying to figure out where they came from. They have found that they came from black market dealers who are known to work for dictatorships and shady intelligence agencies. The cinnabar residue has been linked to a shipment that went missing from a private mineral excavation site in the Philippines 6 months ago. Vatican security has called the case an internal spiritual threat, which is a term that has never been used before. Senior clerics in the Vatican's Office of Exorcism and Doctrine are looking over old records of ritualistic interference in papal affairs. Recently, a memo came to light warning of a final silencing to end the cycle of confusion. Who wrote it is still unknown, and what does it mean? That's the question that everyone in the Church is asking, because if Pope Francis's death wasn't just murder but a signal, then what is it signaling if you want to know? To understand how someone like Pope Francis could have become the target of a slow, planned assassination, you must first understand what he threatened. From the moment he was elected, Pope Francis was seen as someone who had no ties to the traditional parts of the Church. He wasn't born into European aristocracy and wasn't trained in the Vatican's elite diplomatic corps. Instead, he came from Buenos Aires, which is on the edge of the global Church and has some of the most people but few representatives in Vatican governance. When he came out of the Cyprus Chapel as Pope, he didn't just have the keys to the kingdom on him. He also had a sledgehammer aimed at the old walls, which scared the people who had spent their lives building those walls. The Vatican is more than just a place of worship. It's a sovereign city-state with its own intelligence service, bank, military, legal system, and hundreds of years of international influence. The Church acts more like a geopolitical player than a place of worship. There are deals, alliances, and trade. When Pope Francis started to lift the veil of secrecy around the Vatican's finances, alarm bells went off not only in the Church, but also in power networks around the world. He demanded an audit of the Vatican Bank, which had been suspected of laundering money for criminal groups, fired corrupt clerics, and shut down traditional offices that were too full of red tape. He also wanted to know how donations were being spent. For some, these were long, overdue reforms. For others, they were threats to a very profitable status quo. And at the center of this growing conflict were men like Cardinal Tagle, who had been an ally at one point and a rival at another, or maybe something more ambiguous. Tagle was seen as Francis's spiritual heir, but also as a man with his own goals. His popularity, especially in Asia, made him an ideal successor in the eyes of more conservative groups who didn't like how hard Francis was trying to change things. The disagreement wasn't just political, it was theological. Francis pushed for modernization, he encouraged it. He opened up dialogue with people of other religions, especially Islam and Judaism, and even with atheists and agnostics. He softened the Church's stance on LGBTQ+ issues, making headlines when he said, "If someone is gay and seeks the Lord with goodwill, who am I to judge?" He supported deacons and even talked about the possibility of married priests in areas that were severely short on priests. This was a big change that angered traditionalists because the Church had always been about structure and obedience. People believed that things should stay the same and that Francis's openness to new ideas would upset this divine order. While most clergy pretended to be united, behind closed doors, different groups formed. One of these groups was the so-called Roman Orthodox bloc, which was made up of high-ranking cardinals, theologians, and donors who thought the Church had been straying too far from its sacred roots. To them, Francis's embrace of the modern world was not progress but heresy, but they didn't have to be against him. As early as 2021, documents from the Vatican's internal tribunal showed meetings between senior members of the Roman Orthodox bloc, and outside financiers with ties to real estate holdings and private equity groups in Europe and Asia. The meetings were meant to talk about backup plans for after Francis's death, and most of the time they were against him because he made their whole world unstable. This is where the alleged motive starts to become clear. Planning was focused on installing a pope more in line with traditional teachings. Tagle's name came up a lot because of his popularity in the Philippines, connections in Asia, and calm, non-threatening personality, which made him the ideal compromise candidate. He was progressive in tone but traditional in practice. But Francis delayed his resignation despite being sick, and with each month he brought in more reforms, such as a new financial oversight committee, more inclusive theological commissions, a plan to redistribute church land holdings in Latin America, and rumors that Francis was about to reveal a network of off-books Vatican assets used by cardinals to hide their wealth from church oversight. The internal audit was said to be almost finished, and the results were set to be released before the next Senate meeting. If the rumors were true, this would be the biggest threat to church power in the last few hundred years. 200 years ago, someone or some group had every reason to make sure it didn't happen. In this situation, Tagle is more than just a man. He becomes a link between old power and new influence. Whether he planned the poisoning himself or was just a pawn, investigators now think he was a key part of a much bigger game. The compound used to kill Francis needed months of access. It needed someone in the Pope's circle who could slowly introduce the poison without being caught. It needed someone with the Pope's trust. This reason makes even more sense when you consider that on Francis's personal tablet was a draft document called Restoring Sacred Order. It laid out a plan for reorganizing Vatican offices under a new papacy, including taking power away from regional episcopal councils and lowering the requirements for financial transparency. The document was dated 2 months before Francis's death, so it's not just speculation. It's proof that Francis's death wasn't caused by anger or jealousy. They were based on fear. Fear that the church was falling apart from its old elite. Fear that hundreds of years of secrecy and privilege were about to come undone. Fear that a man born not in Rome, but in the slums of Argentina, was about to tear the empire apart brick by brick. In the halls of ancient power, where light rarely shines and truths are layered in smoke and scripture, fear often leads to blood. For years, the Vatican's inner workings have been a source of mystery, wonder, and suspicion, a place where secrets live. It's not an exaggeration to say that inside the walls of the Holy See, silence is not only valued, it's institutionalized. But every institution has its cracks, and now, after the scandals surrounding Pope Francis's death, those cracks are letting in something the Church has feared more than any outside enemy: voices from within. In the days after Cardinal Tagle's arrest, an unprecedented amount of voices from within the Church were heard. There was a wave of leaks, including anonymous letters and internal statements. At first, these tremors were hard to tell apart from the usual swirl of Vatican gossip. But soon they turned into something stronger, more planned, and full of revelations that couldn't be ignored. People who had been working quietly for years in security, finance, clerical support, and liturgy started speaking out. Some did so in private interviews, while others sent documents to trusted reporters under aliases. Even risked their jobs to go on record. What they said wasn't a clear-cut case of good versus evil. Instead, it was a complicated web of lies, threats, and fear, the kind of fear that comes from knowing that something holy has been harmed. One of the first people to blow the whistle was a former administrative assistant to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, who we will call Brother D, in a secret transcript sent to investigators and later confirmed by 2 separate sources. Brother D said that 2 weeks before Pope Francis's death, there was a high-level meeting in the upper chambers of the Apostolic Palace. He said it was casual, and there were no transcripts or secretaries, but I heard about it from one of the stewards who set up the room. They were told to take away any recording devices and not ask questions, which never happens, and Tagle's name came up afterward. When asked if this happened regularly, Brother D said no, didn't even know the meeting was happening. The meeting, which was confirmed by keycard access records and scheduled security rotations, took place at 10 p.m., which is normally very late for church business. No one who attended or what was talked about is known, but it happened just 48 hours before the Pope reportedly got sick for the first time. Another staff member, a former Swiss guard named Giorgio, confirmed that Tagle's movements had changed that same week. He stopped taking his usual route and came in through the kitchen instead. They would sneak up on people at the entrance or sometimes in the archive hallways without any guards. It wasn't the Tagle I knew. When asked why he hadn't reported the behavior earlier, Giorgio said, because here, the line between loyalty and betrayal is paper thin. If you speak out, you're exiled or worse. Then the letter came. It was an anonymous 5-page document sent to anyone with eyes to see. It was verified by matching stamps, letterhead, and internal codes only available within the Vatican. The author said they were a middle-level clerical worker in a state secretariat. One passage said, the Holy Father had seen the first pages of the financial report. He told one of his confidants, if these numbers are true, half of my house is built on blood. He wasn't planning to go public next year or next month, but that week. The letter also said that the Pope had planned a private press conference with a few journalists without telling the rest of the press corps. The purpose of the meeting was to reveal illegal financial channels and fake charitable donations that implicated sitting members of the Curia. The press briefing never happened, and within 5 days the Pope was dead. The letter also mentioned a blessing gone cold, a phrase that Francis was said to use to describe people who had lost. There were more rumors. This time, someone from inside the Vatican Bank spoke up. She was a woman in her 60s named Sister E, who worked in the financial compliance division and was in charge of keeping an eye on strange transactions, donations, and foreign investments. In an interview with internal prosecutors, she said that several accounts that had been flagged for problems in 2023 were suddenly cleared of all problems by override signatures, and one of those overrides had Tagle's name on it. Authorizing seal the money trails went nowhere, she said. She said that money meant for refugee centers in Jordan and schools in Congo was sent to shell companies in Luxembourg and Cyprus. Every time I brought it up, I was told, it's above your grade, stay faithful. But I couldn't when I realized that the Pope himself hadn't been able to see those files. Later, Sister E, he turned in 2 thumb drives of data that are now being forensically examined. Her last words in the statement were simple. He died trying to pull the roots out, and now the tree is trying to eat its own fruit. Some of the saddest stories didn't come from staff or officials, but from priests and nuns who had met Francis in private audiences. For example, a Dominican friar said that the Pope's last visit to their monastery was troubled. He seemed distracted. We had prayed together many times, but that day was different. When I asked him what was wrong, he softly smiled and said, "The wind is changing, brother. I hope I can still hold the candle." That was a week before he died. Another nun remembered Francis taking her aside after a global synod meeting in early March and whispering to her, "Pray for strength not for me but for what follows." I didn't understand back then, but now I do. Even members of the College of Cardinals who hadn't said a word before have started to hint at unrest in the hierarchy. For example, Cardinal Vicente Materiaga of Honduras, who has been a friend of Francis for a long time, was quoted as saying, "We lost a shepherd and gained a storm. The sheep will scatter if we don't name the wolves." During a televised mass, Cardinal Irvin Dassi of Italy gave a more subtle warning. The truth must come out not through revenge, but through confession. This is not a time for secrecy. It is a time for light. Together, these voices, some loud and some barely audible, have started to form a new kind of choir within the Vatican, not of doctrine but of revelation. As the investigation goes on, it's clear that the old rule of silence is breaking because silence in this case was complicity.